And thank you all for joining us. I'm Candice Rupprecht with Utah State University Extension. Adria Wheaton and I organize these monthly webinars, which we really couldn't do without the help of Mark and eExtension, and also with the support of USU's Center for Water Efficient Landscaping. So we really hope you guys have been finding these beneficial. And today we have Candice Rupprecht joining us from Tucson Water, which is Southern Arizona's largest public water utility. Candice has been the water conservation manager there for the past 3 years, and prior to working at Tucson Water, she worked at the University of Arizona's Water Resource Research Center, where she focused on water education, outreach, and conservation research. Today, she's going to share the results of the Tucson Avoided Cost Analysis and how these results have helped to communicate the value of water and the financial benefits of conservation to their customers. So again, please use the Q&A box for questions, and we'll do our best to answer those as we go along. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Candice.
Great, thank you, Candice, and thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. I'm excited to share this study that we've done here in Tucson and get any good questions or feedback that you have on whether this is something that would apply for your community as well. All right. Okay, well, the title that we have here today is The Wild West Tale, Debunking the Myth that Conservation Increases Rates. It's a question that we get a lot, I think, as conservation professionals. This is really the premise for the whole study, looking at the role of conservation and what our water rates are today. Ever wonder why your water rates are going up even though you're using less? So today I'm hopefully here to answer that for you, or at least improve on the basic answer that we often tend to give as conservation professionals. After this study was done, my coworker or my colleague and I, she's out of Gilbert, Arizona, we had a chance to write an article for an Arizona water publication. And so this is just a quote out of that publication that says, Arizona municipalities are no strangers to conservation. In 1980, water management became a core issue of a sustainable future, and conservation was envisioned as one of the solutions to keeping our demand for water in check. And we made that point because we've heard throughout the country that conservation can get a bad rap in terms of its role in declining demand and thus declining revenue. And so we really wanted to put it out there that in Arizona, conservation has been a tenet of our water planning for decades, and conservation is not a short-term solution that we enact. That's what we consider curtailment, and we're not in a curtailment mindset here. We're really in a long-term conservation mindset, and that planning for that long-term conservation is a part of our water portfolios that we view as utilities. And with that in mind, when we talk about water efficiency in this study, and I think in the work that many of us do throughout the country, we view water efficiency as not one, but as many approaches. So there's a long list here of those various approaches that we've employed in Tucson. We certainly have our utility-sponsored conservation and education programs where we offer rebates to customers, as well as a pretty robust youth and professional education, primarily focused on landscape education for our customers. We've had long-standing conservation and outreach campaigns. We have Pete the Beak, who's been around actually since the 70s, and I know many other communities have these long-term outreach campaigns as well. We have an increasing block rate structure that really incentivizes customers to use less because they'll pay more for water the more they use. And that's another thing that we've had in place for a couple of decades here in Tucson. And I know a lot of communities in the West have similar rate structures. We have a variety of local ordinances that have really driven conservation. We have a zero-scape landscaping ordinance that's been in place for 3 decades, a water waste ordinance that's been in place since the 80s, and more recently, a commercial rainwater harvesting ordinance. So in Tucson, we take ordinances as the opportunity to really drive conservation, especially in the outdoor sector in our community. As well, we have plumbing codes. So across the country, plumbing codes have really helped drive the market in terms of the technology that's available that leads to efficient use of water. And so in Tucson, we've adopted the International Plumbing Code just like many other communities. And then there's additional national policy that drives this innovation and technology, and that's primarily Energy Star that started in 2002, and more recently WaterSense, which started in 2006. It just celebrated its decade of helping drive the market for water conservation and efficiency. And without those national programs, I don't think we'd be as far as we are as a profession in terms of making water efficient products available to consumers. All right, so with that in mind, that we think of water efficiency as a suite of options, I want to just introduce this idea of the avoided cost analysis. It was funded actually by the Alliance for Water Efficiency, who had received a grant from the Walton Family Foundation, with focus on really a variety of work and conservation options that they're exploring for the Colorado River Basin. And the goal of the avoided cost study was to examine the impact of increased water use efficiency on customer rates. And we were fortunate to participate along with Gilbert, Arizona. So in 2015, the Alliance for Water Efficiency partnered with both Tucson, Arizona and Gilbert, Arizona. And actually the work was done by WaterDM, which is a small consulting firm out of Boulder, Colorado. And that's actually Peter Mayer, if any of you are familiar with the work he's done. He's done a lot of work around the country on demand management and forecasting related to water supplies. And all of this sort of was preceded by a study that was done in Westminster, Colorado, that Peter had authored with the local utility professionals there, looking at the role of conservation. And they actually found that in Westminster, water rates would have been 90% higher if there had never been conservation. Water is extremely expensive on the Front Range of Colorado, so there was a huge cost factor there, but really set the stage for looking at this question around the country. And the question that we're trying to sort of give a better response to is this customer question that we get all the time. Why are my rates going up again when I keep conserving water? And I don't know if any of you have taken a stab at answering that, but I know that we have taken a stab at answering that. And it goes something like this. And I'm just going to read what I have written here because it actually sounds funny and silly to understand this really complicated answer that we give, but essentially it's complicated. Costs of operating our water system and our wastewater system have increased, yet our community's conservation efforts have helped. Without conservation, we'd need to produce more water, which means more infrastructure, more employees, more chemicals to treat the water, more energy to move the water, and plainly, more water. All of these costs would add up to higher water bills than you have today. So ultimately, customers are confused and frustrated by that answer because it is complicated. Utilities are a complicated system to understand and to communicate, and trying to tell them that their water bills would actually be more expensive without conservation has, I think, been met with mixed success in terms of customer acceptance of that statement. All right, so the first question that I have for you, we're going to do a poll. Do I turn it over to you, Mark? No, I do a little intro of what the poll is.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question is, have you ever heard this complaint from a community member? Or have you thought this same thing, that why are my water rates going up when I continue to conserve water?
Okay. All right, good. We've got a poll was launched, folks. A couple of you had responded. We'll just take another 5 to 10 seconds. All right, just another second or two. All right, great. And then Candice, can you see that?
I can see the results,
yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Great. So almost all of us have either thought that ourselves or heard that from a community member. And so it's a question that I think is worth trying to answer. And we went down this road in Tucson, and I think we're really glad that we have some more robust and solid answers that we can share with our community. So the rest of my talk today is going to be about sharing our avoided cost analysis experience, giving you a little background on Tucson, Arizona, and thinking of whether there's potential in your community to do something similar. All right, so welcome to Tucson, Arizona. As was mentioned earlier, Tucson Water is the largest public utility in southern Arizona. We deliver water to over 700,000 customers, and that's in about a 400 square mile area in the metropolitan Tucson basin. So what's maybe unique to Tucson, but what you see across the Southwest, is that we have pretty low population density. So that's a lot of customers, but it's also a lot of land area that we are building that infrastructure over and around to deliver water to those customers for. And just to give you a sense of proximity to the rest of the state. So we're in southeastern Arizona, and then what you see on this map is the Colorado River and the CAP Canal, which is the Central Arizona Project Canal. That's really the mechanism that we rely on to get most of our water to Tucson. So we import water from the Colorado River through a 330-mile canal that makes its way to Phoenix and then to Tucson. And to give you a sense of our customer portfolio, we're predominantly residential. Over 90% of our accounts are residential, and they make up just about 3/4 of total potable usage on our system. So we're a predominantly residential community, but a large residential community. And then to give you an idea of our water supply portfolio, we essentially have 3 water supplies. The largest and the one we're most dependent on is that Colorado River. We import that, again, across Arizona, and then we recharge it into basins west of town, and that's the images you see on the right there. We put them in we put that water in large recharge basins, and then we're able to pump that water out of the ground after it's infiltrated to the aquifer and then deliver that to our customers. We also use recycled water. We have a reclaimed water system that provides about 10% of our total water use in Tucson. We do have some native groundwater that we're still pumping. And then we have a treatment plant that is treating for TCE and 1,4-dioxane and through an advanced treatment process. And that actually is immediately available for customer use and put into our distribution system. So in total, we're producing just over 100,000 acre-feet a year. That was the number from 2016. And you can see that we do have a diversity of water supplies, but we're primarily dependent on the Colorado River. And I like to share this information just to give people a sense of what Tucson is thinking of in terms of our hydrologic outlook. So we actually store about 1/3 of our Colorado River allocation each year, and that gave us the opportunity in 2016 to leave just under 27,000 acre-feet in Lake Mead to help with system conservation. And currently we're on track to have over 1 million acre-feet in storage by 2030, which we're excited and proud of. And one of the big challenges that we've really addressed in Tucson is this idea of overpumping our aquifers. We had a serious problem with groundwater depletion for a long time. And what this map shows you is that we're really working hard to change the course of our aquifer health. And the purple indicates areas where groundwater table has risen significantly, and you see that's where we're recharging our basins, or recharging water in Abra Valley, which is to the west of Tucson. And then I think the thing we're most proud of is that green circle in the middle of the Tucson area, and that also is indicating that those water table levels are coming up, which is a reversal from what was happening for decades. So we're happy to see this trend, and we're planning on making that trend continue. All right, so starting to transition to the area for the avoided cost study. This was a partnership with Tucson Water and the Pima County Wastewater Department, because the city only manages the potable water. We deliver the water, but then the wastewater is managed by the county, and they actually treat the water and put it into the recycled water system. So both entities worked on this study, and this just gives you a sense of sort of the regional nature of this study. We have a large service area at Tucson Water, and then the wastewater department also has a similar large area, and so we were able to utilize information from 2 of their large regional treatment plants that correlate pretty closely with our service area for potable water. All right, so this is maybe a graph you've seen before, but essentially what we're looking at here is total municipal and industrial water use in the U.S. over the last 100+ years. And so what we see that I think is really important to point out is that total use peaked in the 1980s, and since then we've seen a steady but small decline every decade. Per capita water use is the same. It really peaked in the 70s and 80s and has been on a more precipitous decline since then. And we see that nationally, and we see that trend play out in communities all over the country, including Tucson. What you're looking at here is a graph that shows total annual water production starting in 1940 up through the year 2016. So the dark blue is our groundwater supply. Light blue is our Central Arizona project, or our Colorado River supply. purple is reclaimed, and then the green is the tarp. So importantly, we are actually using the same amount of potable water in Tucson that we used in the 1980s with over 200,000 more people. So we've gotten more efficient as a community, and we're proud of that. And that's a trend that we see continuing in Tucson, but we also see happening around the country. And, you know, the other thing to point out is that we used to be the largest city in the country, 100% dependent on groundwater, and that's that dark blue. And we've really reversed that trend, as I was showing you with those hydrologic maps, that we're no longer mining our aquifer in that way. All right, so the first step of this avoided cost analysis is to look in the past, look at what the historic water use has been, and set a baseline that we can really calculate from into the future. So to do that, we need to take a look at population and system per capita water use to establish our baseline. This is Tucson's total GPCD over the last few decades. And you can see that it held steady for, you know, through the 80s and 90s and really into the early 2000s. It held steady. And then since 2000, we've seen about a 31%, well, not since 2000. Since 1989, we've seen about a 31% decline. But most of that decline has happened in the last 15 to 18 years. Another way to look at these indicators is to compare population and GPCD. So this graph starts at the year 2000, and you can see that population, which is the teal line, has continued to increase for the last several decades, while potable GPCD has continued to decline. So what we know is that population has increased about 40% from 1989 to 2015 and has dropped, and per capita demand, or GPCD, has dropped about 31% from 1989 to 2015. And you'll see in a moment, but 1989, we ended up deciding as the year that we established as the baseline for this study, because that was really right at the peak of GPCD and total demand for the community. And since then, we've seen really a shift in how the community is using water. All right, on to our next poll question. Does your community have a similar relationship with population and GPCD, hence a growing population and a decreasing GPCD?
All right, I've launched that poll, folks. We'll just take another 10 seconds. Okay. All righty.
Excellent. So that's probably not surprising to any of us, because we do see this trend happening in communities of different sizes and different geographies around the country. But absolutely, we see that many places population has continued to increase while GPCD has decreased. And that's a good news story for conservation, because it means people are getting more efficient with their water use. Another way that we've liked to highlight water use in Tucson is to look at single-family average annual water usage. So it has a similar trend to that total GPCD, but essentially about a 40% reduction in single-family usage from 1989 to 2015. And we know that a lot of that is due to landscape shifts over time. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a typical landscape in Tucson was evergreen trees and a lot of turf, neither of which are really native to Tucson, but had been a result of a lot of people from around the country moving to Tucson and relocating. And the present day landscape is much more xeric, desert adapted, drought tolerant plants are really the predominant species that we see in landscapes today. On the indoor side, this is taken out of an end use study that was done in 1999 and again in 2015, looking at the specific ways that water is used within residential customers' households. So in 1999, across the country, the average indoor usage was just under 70 GPCD. When the study was done again in 2015, it was just under 60 GPCD. And the study authors think that the next goal or the next target is this idea of a high efficiency household, which would be under 40 GPCD. which would be another big jump. But that was already about a 15% reduction in indoor water use over that 15-year study period, or about a 1% reduction per year. And Tucson's right there. We have about an 8 CCF monthly average per residential customer. And so we're right there, about just under that 60 GPCD indoor. And if you haven't seen this before, I think it's interesting just to look at how that 60 GPCD actually breaks down. So again, from the 1999 study and the 2015 study, looking at the specific end uses within a house, toilets and clothes washers were the highest in 1999 and remain 2 of the highest uses, but you can see statistically significant reductions in both clothes washers, toilets, and also in dishwashers. So when customers ask, where they're using the most water, we like to highlight this type of information because it gives customers an idea of both why we offer the rebate programs we do and really where they can put their dollars in terms of reducing water use at the household level. Another way that we looked at what the trend is in residential use is to compare indoor and outdoor use, really just looking at January versus June usage. So what you see is that June usage is the red line and January usage is the blue line, trending back from 1990 through 2016. And we find that exterior use has decreased over 50% in that time period, while interior use has decreased just under 25%. So the bulk of water conservation has happened in the outdoor space in Tucson, and I think that's true for a lot of communities, especially throughout the Southwest. Historically, outdoor water use in Tucson was 45% of total residential use, and now it's less than 30%. All right, so here we get to the parameters for the analysis. That was a long lead up to explain all the different trends that we've seen in Tucson, but the bottom line is that we're looking at 1989, as our baseline, and 2015 when the study was done. And we know that in 1989, per capita water use, or GPCD, was 188. And in 2015, it was only 130. So we saw a significant reduction in GPCD. At the same time, we saw an increase in population of over 200,000 people within our service area. On the wastewater side, it's a similar trend. The wastewater system was treating about 105 GPCD in 1989, and in 2015, they were only treating about 78 GPCD. So now that we know the baseline parameters that we're starting with, the question becomes, what would our situation be today if we had continued at 1989 consumption levels? And this is really the fun part of the analysis, because we create a hypothetical scenario where we calculate what amount of water and what amount of wastewater capacity we would have needed to treat the amount of water that was being used per person in 1989, but with the population levels that we have today. So what we find is that with the 1989 GPCD, which was 188, if we extrapolate that based on a population of over 700,000 people, we would have needed 134.4 million gallons per day of production. But in reality, we only used, as you see in that middle part right here, we only used 93.3. We actually produced less in 2015 than we did in 1989. But the 134 MGD is showing you how much more water we would have needed if conservation had never taken hold in Tucson and we had never started reducing our water use. And similar on the wastewater side, we used just slightly more in terms of wastewater flow in 2015 than we did in 1989, but we would have needed about 25 MGD more if conservation had never happened in our community. All right, so now we know how much more water the community would have needed to meet that higher demand with a larger population that we see today. But we know that that didn't happen, that we actually were able to avoid needing that additional water. And so the question becomes, what does the utility save when this hypothetical water isn't needed? And hence we call that our avoided cost. So what happens next is that we go on a fact-finding mission to figure out and to ascertain what the various inputs and assumptions are related to those avoided costs. So first we have to identify any additional investments that have been avoided or significantly delayed. And that takes a look at transmission and conveyance, so the infrastructure that's moving the water, water and wastewater treatment, the chemicals and labor that go into treating that water, any debt service that we've been able to avoid or delay, and new infrastructure that we haven't had to build because we didn't need that additional capacity. We also have to identify the variable O&M tied to additional. So what amount of operating costs would increase because we would need to be producing and delivering more water than we are today. And then after we've identified all these factors, we have to agree. And that was actually one of the more challenging parts of this study, because this exercise included talking to our engineers and our operations folks and our finance team, and really getting them to tell us what are reasonable assumptions to make, and specifically, how much infrastructure we didn't need and how much more we would have needed to pay for the water if we had actually needed more of that water. So once we did this fact-finding mission, we were able to agree on the inputs and assumptions, and then we could run the model to take a look at what the actual cost benefits are of these avoided costs. So I'd like to highlight what some of the key avoided costs were, both for the water and wastewater side, because this really illustrates the magnitude or the powerful role that conservation can play in our communities. So on the water side, we were able to avoid building a $140 million transmission main that was a CIP project that was scheduled actually just in the last 5 years, that we decided we didn't need to build because we didn't need that additional capacity. We also didn't build a $15 million recycled water facility that would have provided an additional 7 million gallons a day to our system. On the operating cost side, we've avoided about $22 million a year in O&M costs for the water system alone. And unique to Tucson, actually, because we have more water supply allocation than we're using right now, and we're storing that for the future, we don't actually have avoided costs related to our water supply. However, this was one of the areas where staff really had strong opinions that we might have taken an extremely conservative approach, because it's reasonable to assume that even if we don't need the water supply now, the water supply that we're buying in the future may be more expensive, so there might actually be additional avoided costs because we're not having to buy as much water as we otherwise would have been. So all of these are the costs avoided by not having to purchase, treat, and deliver that extra 41 MGD a day. And on the wastewater side, it's a similar picture. So they always think in terms of capacity of the system, and they actually did have to do a big upgrade to the treatment plant regionally to meet some water quality standards. But when they did that upgrade, they were able to downsize it more than they thought they would be able to. So they actually avoided $195 million for an additional 12 MGD of capacity that they originally thought that they would need, but ultimately didn't need because demand has gone down over time. And they estimated about $6.5 million a year in O&M costs that they've avoided on the wastewater treatment side. Just to give you a sense, when wastewater builds out capacity, they assume that for every 1 MGD additional capacity they need in their system, it costs $16 million. So it's a pretty clear cost savings when you're able to decrease the capacity or the size of the treatment plants that you're designing and building. All right, so this is how it breaks down in terms of what the total avoided cost picture looks like. So total avoided costs for the Tucson study were $415 million. And $350 million of that was in infrastructure. So some pretty high dollar price tags in terms of infrastructure that didn't need to be built or has been significantly delayed because water demand has gone down in Tucson. And about 2/3 of the avoided costs actually fall on the water side, and about 1/3 fall on the wastewater side. And that's what you see there on the pie chart. So now that we know the total avoided costs that we've been able to accrue in Tucson, The question then becomes, well, how does this conservation translate to dollars, and what's the cash benefit for customers? Because that's ultimately the selling point here, is that we want to communicate to our customers what their pocketbook impact is of our community's role in conservation over the last several decades. So how are customer bills affected? Well, in 2015, the average residential customer was using about 74,000 gallons of water. And they were also needing about 63,000 gallons of wastewater treatment. And that was costing them $847 annually. If we look at the non-conserving hypothetical scenario, where we assume more growth needing that higher historic water amount, they would have needed, on average, 97,000 gallons of water a year, and they would have needed 82,000 gallons of wastewater treatment. And that would have cost them about $959. So there's a difference there of $111 that they don't have to pay, because as a community, we've conserved water, our demand is down, and therefore we've avoided these significant costs that would have ultimately gone into the rates and hit their pocketbooks. So customers are paying less. Tucson water bills are 15% lower today, and the Pima County wastewater bills are just under 9% lower today than they otherwise would have had to be to meet those higher historic or those higher hypothetical scenarios. So due to water efficiency, combined bills today are at least 11.7% lower than otherwise necessary. And we say at least because we still feel like it can be what we've provided as a fairly conservative estimate of what true avoided costs could look like for our community, especially as the cost of water increases in the future. So it's a good news story that we now have an answer to tell our customers about. And because we partnered with the Alliance for Water Efficiency, they worked with us to develop these really nice infographics. So the one you see on the left is for Gilbert, Arizona. I didn't talk at all about their avoided cost study. And the one you see on the right is for Tucson. But I wanted to highlight both of them because I think they both tell a similar story, that conservation has really played a role in keeping water rates lower than they are today, or than they otherwise would be, excuse me. So on the Tucson side, you see that, the 1989 baseline compared to the 2015 information, and at the very bottom you see, total savings of just under 12%. On the Gilbert side, they have a total savings of about 6%. So bills are 6% lower today than they otherwise would have had to be. But interestingly for Gilbert, they also have a tap fee, and they were able to quantify that because they didn't need to acquire more water and new supplies, tap fees or connection fees that each customer has to pay when they want to, build a new house or build a new business, that's almost $10,000 per customer that they've been able to avoid. So those are some significant savings that the town of Gilbert has been able to promote in terms of the role of conservation and helping their community continue to grow, but grow in a water efficient and sustainable way. So the bottom line here is that when everyone conserves, everyone saves. And I think it's definitely fair and it's accurate to point out that the costs of providing water and wastewater service are increasing. Maintaining and improving infrastructure is expensive, and operating that system and all of the employee labor that goes into that system is not cheap. However, planned long-term conservation is not why rates are increasing. And I think really importantly, when we have a solid number to talk about what these avoided costs are for our community, it provides an entry point to talk about the value of our water systems and their ability to provide safe, reliable water for our communities right now and into the future. And conservation is not the reason that we need to have rate increases, but maintaining that reliable system and that safe infrastructure is, that is the reason. And, a good, fair reason that we do have rate increases to make sure that those systems operate and, stay safe over time. So overall, conservation keeps rates lower over time. We found that both in Gilbert, Arizona and in Tucson, Arizona. And that's, a good news story that we are really working hard to communicate with our customers. All right, so I have one more poll. And the question is, do you think your community has a similar conservation saves cash success story?
Okay, I've launched that poll and we'll just take about 10 seconds. Okay, just another 5 seconds. Okay.
So it's mixed, and I think I'd be curious to know in the communities where you think it wouldn't be able to communicate that same message, why. I know that when we were looking at other communities to participate in this avoided cost study, some communities simply don't have any water supply challenges. And so there are not really many costs to avoid because they have all the water they could possibly need into the future. And there may be other reasons like, you know, infrastructure that's already built out that would mean that there's no more cost to avoid. But I think if it's a question that your community is facing, then this is an interesting approach to try and answer that, to, again, give some pretty simple and clear messaging to your community about what the role of conservation is. All right, well, I wanted to share with you before we wrap up sort of the bigger picture of how this avoided cost study fits into some work being done by the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and then share a video with you that they've created because I think it's a powerful tool to get customers thinking again about what they actually pay for when they're paying their water bill. So the avoided cost study is part of this bigger initiative called Financing Sustainable Water, and there's a website. That's the website, Financing Sustainable Water, again, put out by the Alliance for Water Efficiency, really addressing some rate questions and some efficiency questions that communities across the country are facing. So just to give you a sense of how water and sewer rates compare to other utilities, the cost of water and sewer has increased much more significantly over time than electricity, natural gas, other utility services. And we know that providing this reliable service, you can't necessarily put a price on that because we wouldn't have the communities we have today without the reliable water services that we have. But we also know that revenue can be volatile, especially in times where demand is fluctuating quite a bit. So the Alliance has put together some tools to help communities build more sustainable rates and do some really innovative sales forecasting and rate modeling to help make sure that they don't have revenue crises that are affected by demand. And so again, their website is financingsustainablewater.org. They have a great rate model, and they have some great communications tools to help cities and customers understand the role of sustainable financing within the water rate and utility structure. So this is one video, water and what are you paying for, that's available on their website. And then the second video I'm actually going to show you because I think it is worth it's worth a quick watch because it really gives us a good idea of how to communicate this message.
A concerned customer at a public meeting says, "I'm using less water, but my bill is higher. What gives?" Good question, and one we'd love to answer. First, know that the water system where you live and the pipes, plants, people, and power that deliver water is yours. The water bills you pay are used to keep the water clean and flowing and the place you live going and growing. To bring you the best, safest, and most reliable water around, your provider needs to invest in the system. They're replacing and updating aging pipes and plants and using new technologies like smart meters and leak detection. These investments make your community's water system more efficient and help ensure water for the future. So, if your rates change and your bill goes up, remember that your money is going to make these important improvements. And water service, when and where you need it, remains an incredible value. But what's the best way to keep rates low? Conservation. Conservation is the key to delaying or even eliminating the need for more expensive investments down the line. Use less now, and you'll pay less later. How does that work? Because to serve your community into the future, your utility may need to buy water, expand the system, use more chemicals to treat the water, or use more energy to move it. Many of those costs would be covered by you, the customer. That's why it's cheaper to make the water you already have go further. If people use only the water they need, your provider could serve everyone today and tomorrow with the current system and supply. No need to build new pipes or plants until you really need them. Plus, use less water, there's also less to clean. Conservation also saves water for emergencies. Pretty important considering the limited amount here on Earth. Even better, using less keeps the lakes, rivers, and groundwater aquifers where you live full and healthy. This makes wildlife happy and keeps activities like swimming, boating, and fishing fun for everybody. Will water rates keep rising? Yes, and for many reasons. But thanks to conservation, rates may not go up nearly as much. And remember, when you conserve, you'll always pay less than those who don't. So, if your water bill makes you wonder, what gives? Now you know. Any other good questions? Call your water provider to learn more about rates and how to conserve.
All right. Well, please feel free to use that video and share that video. I know the Alliance would be happy if you did that. The last slide I have is just showcasing for you what their website looks like. So you can go to financingsustainablewater.org. You can get those videos. You can see their rate model, and you can see how other communities around the country have used these resources to help really think about the rate structure that makes the most sense for them, keeps them financially secure, but also really continues to drive conservation and efficiency. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you have, and I appreciate you being on this webinar today and hearing about the avoided cost study. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Candice. We don't have any questions at the moment, but I would like to thank all of you guys for coming, and hopefully we'll see you next month. We do these every month on the second Tuesday at 2 p.m., and our next webinar is scheduled for May 8th.
And I'll put a link. We'll just give folks another 30 seconds. And if there's any burning questions, I'm going to put a link in chat to the Learn event. You probably got here through the Learn event, but recording should be posted there within a few days. So feel free to share that with any colleagues or friends that were not able to join us.
Thank you, Mark. And it looks like we do have one question in the chat box. Jessica's wondering who initiated and how the cost benefit analysis.
Who initiated the cost-benefit analysis? Let me just read it. It's actually, the model was built by Peter Mayer, who is the consultant with WaterDM. So he had worked with Westminster, Colorado first, and they designed that model together, and then it's his model that he's used to do both the Tucson and Gilbert studies. But I've seen other cities around the country do similar work on their own, building their own models. So I think it's something that if you're interested, you could talk to him about, or you could certainly, I can talk to you more and help you with some pointers on how you might do that yourself.
And then we have another question from Dan. It says, one question that comes up in Tucson is why meter rates go up rather than volumetric rates. Wouldn't that encourage conservation?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. One question that comes up in Tucson is why the meter rate goes up rather than the volumetric rates. Wouldn't that encourage conservation?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I think, because many utilities experience some stresses around revenue when the economy was having its struggles, I've seen a lot of utilities, and this is happening in Tucson also, shift towards more of a fixed cost base and then easing up a little bit on the volumetric rates. And volumetric rates are certainly what drive behavior in terms of not using as much water in those higher tiers. But utilities have about 80% of their costs being fixed and about 20% attributable to, delivery or volumetric rates. And so there's a movement around the country to try and get that back in alignment a little bit and put a little more of the cost of water in that fixed or that meter fee and a little bit less in that variable or volumetric fee. So it's just sort of a realignment of how we do our rate structures to make sure that we do always have, a secure revenue for the water supply, regardless of how much people are using.
I think that's it.
Okay, no more questions. Okay, everyone have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you again next month. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.